She found fault with everything: my appearance, voice, even the way I walked. I thought she was just a toxic woman. But one day, I heard her phone conversation and learned that she was convinced I was her son. Growing up, I always felt like there was something wrong with me whenever Aunt Sarah was around. The way she looked at me wasn't just disapproval. It was something deeper, more personal. While my cousins got hugs and presents, I got scrutinizing stares and cutting remarks. She'd tell me I had a too feminine smile, or that I irritated everyone just by being there. At family gatherings, she'd literally set up a separate table for me, away from her own kids, like I was contaminated or something. I remember being 7 years old at my cousin's birthday party, watching all the other kids play together while I sat alone at this little card table she'd dragged from the basement. When I asked if I could join the games, she'd wave her hand dismissively and say I was too disruptive. My parents would give me sympathetic looks from across the room, but they never intervened. They always said the same thing: "She's strange, but family is family." As I got older, the comments became more pointed. She'd criticize everything from the way I held my fork to how I laughed. Once, when I was about 12, I accidentally spilled grape juice on her white carpet. Instead of just cleaning it up, she stood there for 10 minutes telling me how careless and thoughtless I was, how I never considered other people's feelings or belongings. The way she said it made me feel like I was fundamentally flawed as a person. By the time I hit my teens, I started avoiding family functions altogether. I'd make excuses about homework or friends, anything to not have to sit through another meal of her passive-aggressive comments and cold stares. My mom would guilt-trip me about it, saying I was being dramatic and that Sarah meant well. But I knew what I felt in that house. It was like being under a microscope, being found wanting every single second. The worst part was how it affected my relationship with my cousins. They were actually pretty cool kids, but Sarah had created this invisible barrier between us. They seemed confused by her behavior too, but they were young and didn't question their mom. I started to wonder if maybe there really was something wrong with me, something that made me inherently unlikable or annoying. High school was a relief because I had legitimate reasons to be busy and absent from family events. I threw myself into activities, made friends, tried to build a life that didn't revolve around wondering why my own aunt seemed to despise my existence. But the damage was done. I carried this underlying feeling of not being good enough, of being somehow fraudulent or wrong. When I turned 18, I thought maybe things would change. Maybe she'd see me as an adult and we could have a fresh start. But if anything, her hostility seemed to intensify. At my graduation party, she made a comment about how I finally looked like I might amount to something, which was probably the closest thing to a compliment I'd ever gotten from her. Even that felt backhanded and strange. Then came the day that changed everything. I was 19, home from my first year of college for summer break. I'd gone over to my parents' house to do laundry because the machines in my apartment were broken. Sarah was there having coffee with my mom, which was unusual because they weren't particularly close. I was upstairs folding clothes when I heard Sarah's phone ring. At first, I didn't pay attention to her conversation. But then her voice got louder, more emotional, and I couldn't help but overhear. She was crying, actually sobbing, which was shocking because I'd never seen her show that kind of vulnerability. I found myself frozen at the top of the stairs, listening to words that made no sense at first. She was talking about an accident, about being told her baby had died. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. "I know it's him. They stole my son and passed him off as their own." She kept repeating it, over and over, through her tears. "He has his father's eyes, the same stubborn chin. I see it every time I look at him." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. She was talking about me. She thought I was her son, stolen from her somehow. Everything, all the years of hostility, the strange looks, the separate tables, suddenly had a completely different context. She wasn't treating me badly because she hated me. She was treating me badly because she thought my parents had taken her child and were raising him as their own. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to process what I'd heard. My hands were shaking as I crept back to the laundry room, my mind racing with questions. How long had she believed this? Was there any truth to it? And most importantly, did my parents know what she thought? The conversation downstairs had ended by the time I came down with my laundry basket. Sarah was gone, and my mom was washing dishes with an unusual intensity, her movements sharp and agitated. I wanted to ask her about what I'd heard, but something about her posture told me she was already dealing with something heavy. I went back to my apartment, but I couldn't concentrate on anything. I kept replaying Sarah's words, trying to make sense of them. The more I thought about it, the more questions arose. I did look different from my parents. I had darker hair, a different bone structure. But lots of kids don't look exactly like their parents. That was normal, right? Update 1. I couldn't sleep that night, so I did something I'd never done before. I started looking through old family photos. My parents had albums going back decades, and I'd never really paid close attention to the timeline of my early years. What I found made my stomach drop. There were tons of pictures of my parents together in their early 20s, traveling, going to parties, looking like a typical young couple. Then there was this weird gap, almost a year where there were hardly any photos at all. And then suddenly, there I was, as a baby, with no pictures from a hospital, no newborn shots, no pregnancy photos of my mom. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they just weren't big on taking pictures during that time. Maybe the pregnancy photos got lost. But combined with what I'd overheard Sarah saying, it felt like puzzle pieces clicking into place in a way that terrified me. The next morning, I called in sick to my summer job and drove to the public library. I spent hours going through old newspaper archives, searching for any mention of accidents or missing children from around the time I would have been born. I didn't find anything concrete, but I did find several articles about a multi-car accident that had happened about 20 years ago. The details were sparse, but it involved several casualties and injured parties. One name caught my eye in the list of victims, a woman with the same last name as Sarah's maiden name. The article mentioned she was survived by a husband and infant son. My heart was pounding as I printed out the article. The dates lined up with when I would have been born. I drove home in a daze, the newspaper printout burning a hole in my backpack. I needed to talk to my parents, but I was terrified of what I might learn. What if Sarah was right? What if everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie? That evening, I sat my parents down in the living room. My mom could tell something was wrong immediately. She had that worried look she got when she knew I was upset about something big. My dad was trying to act casual, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. I told them about overhearing Sarah's phone call, about the things she'd said. I watched their faces carefully as I spoke, looking for any sign of recognition or guilt. What I saw was worse than I'd expected. They both went completely pale, and my mom's hand flew to her mouth. The silence stretched on forever. Finally, my dad cleared his throat and asked me to sit down. That's when I knew my world was about to change completely. They told me a story I'd never heard before, about my mom's sister who had died in a car accident when I was just a few months old, about how she'd left behind a baby, me, and how my parents had taken me in because there was no one else. They'd been planning to tell me when I was older, but years passed, and it never seemed like the right time. But here's where it got complicated. Sarah wasn't just my aunt by marriage. She was my biological mother's sister-in-law. And after the accident, she'd had some kind of breakdown. She'd been in the car too, had suffered a head injury, and when she woke up in the hospital, she couldn't remember what had happened to her own baby. The thing is, Sarah had been pregnant too. She'd lost her baby in the accident, a miscarriage caused by the trauma. But her head injury had affected her memory, and somehow she'd gotten it into her head that her baby had survived and been taken by my parents. She thought I was her son, not her sister-in-law's. My parents had tried to get her help, had brought in doctors and counselors, but she'd been so convinced of her version of events that she'd rejected all attempts at treatment. Eventually, she'd seemed to stabilize, but she'd never let go of the belief that I was her stolen child. The cruelest part was that she'd been grieving her real baby all these years, while simultaneously resenting me for being the child she thought should have been hers. Every time she looked at me, she saw what she believed was her stolen son being raised by people who had betrayed her in the worst possible way. Update 2. Learning the truth about Sarah's delusion should have brought me closure, but instead it opened up a whole new set of problems. My parents sat me down for several more conversations over the next few weeks, filling in details about my biological parents and the accident that had changed all our lives. My biological mother had been my mom's younger sister, someone I'd heard mentioned in passing but never really thought much about. She'd been just 22 when she died, married to a guy who'd also been killed in the same accident. I was their only child, barely 6 months old when it happened. The accident itself had been horrific, a multi-car pileup on the interstate during a rainstorm. Sarah and her husband had been in one car, my biological parents in another. Sarah's husband had died on impact, and she'd lost her pregnancy due to the trauma. My biological parents had also died, but I'd been in a car seat and had somehow survived with just minor injuries. What made it even more tragic was that Sarah and my biological mother had been close friends before they became sisters-in-law. They'd been pregnant at almost the same time, excited about raising their kids together. The accident had destroyed not just lives, but the entire future they'd planned. My parents explained that they'd initially taken me in temporarily, while the family figured out what to do. But Sarah's mental state had deteriorated rapidly after the accident. She'd become obsessed with the idea that her baby was still alive, that there had been some mix-up at the hospital. When she saw me at family gatherings, her delusion focused on me as the missing piece of her shattered life. The really heartbreaking part was that my parents had tried everything to help her. They'd brought in grief counselors, doctors, even a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma-related delusions. But Sarah had been so resistant to treatment, so convinced that everyone was lying to her, that nothing had worked. Over the years, her obsession had morphed into this strange mixture of love and resentment. She believed I was her son, so part of her felt protective and connected to me. But she also believed my parents had stolen me from her, so she resented my presence in their lives. The result was this toxic dynamic where she couldn't stay away from me, but also couldn't be kind to me. My dad admitted that they'd considered cutting contact with Sarah completely, but she was the only family link I had to my biological parents. They'd hoped that someday she'd get better, that we could all find a way to heal together. Instead, her condition had just festered for years, poisoning every family interaction. Now that I knew the truth, I found myself looking at Sarah completely differently. The next time I saw her at a family barbecue, I watched her watching me. I could see the pain in her eyes, the way she'd stare at me like she was trying to memorize my face. When I laughed at something my cousin said, she flinched like the sound physically hurt her. But I also noticed things I'd missed before. The way she'd save me the last piece of cake, even though she'd spent the whole evening criticizing me. How she'd always ask my parents about my grades, my health, my friends, even though she'd never ask me directly. There was love there, twisted and damaged, but real. The hardest part was realizing that all those years I'd spent feeling rejected and inadequate had been based on her mental illness, not any real flaw in me. I'd internalized so much of her criticism, had spent my teenage years wondering what was wrong with me. Now I understood that her hostility had never been about me at all. It had been about her own grief and confusion. I started researching trauma-induced delusions, trying to understand what Sarah had been going through. I learned that head injuries can sometimes cause persistent false beliefs that feel completely real to the person experiencing them. In Sarah's case, her delusion was probably her mind's way of coping with the unbearable loss of her husband and baby. The knowledge was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because I finally understood that I wasn't fundamentally unlovable or flawed. Devastating because I realized that Sarah had been suffering all these years too, trapped in a version of reality that kept her from healing. I decided I wanted to try to connect with her somehow, but I wasn't sure how to approach it. My parents were worried that any direct confrontation might make her condition worse. But I felt like I owed it to both of us to try to find some kind of peace. The opportunity came a few weeks later at my cousin's wedding. Sarah had been particularly agitated that day, making more cutting remarks than usual. But I also noticed she kept looking at me with this expression of such deep sadness that it broke my heart. During the reception, I found her sitting alone outside, crying quietly. Without thinking too much about it, I sat down next to her. She tensed up immediately, but she didn't leave. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sunset. Finally, I told her I knew about the accident, about her baby, about everything. I didn't try to convince her that her beliefs were wrong. I just acknowledged her pain. I told her I was sorry for her loss, that I couldn't imagine how hard it had been for her all these years. She broke down completely then, sobbing in a way that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Through her tears, she told me how much she'd missed her baby, how every day she wondered what he would have looked like, what kind of person he would have become. She said seeing me grow up had been both a blessing and a torture, because she got to witness the childhood she'd lost while feeling powerless to claim it. Final update. That conversation with Sarah outside the wedding reception became a turning point for both of us, though not in the way I'd expected. She didn't suddenly recover from her delusion or acknowledge that I wasn't her biological son. But something shifted in how we related to each other. Over the following months, Sarah's behavior toward me changed dramatically. Instead of criticism and coldness, she became almost protective. She'd call my parents to check on me when I was stressed about school. She started inviting me to family dinners and actually seemed to enjoy my company. The hostile scrutiny was replaced by a kind of intense maternal attention that was both touching and slightly overwhelming. My parents were initially worried about this development, afraid that Sarah's delusion was getting stronger. But her new attitude toward me seemed to be helping her overall mental state. She was less anxious, more engaged with the rest of the family, and even started talking about getting counseling for her grief over her husband's death. The really unexpected turn came about 6 months after the wedding. Sarah had been seeing a grief counselor, and apparently, something about processing her husband's death had started to crack open her rigid beliefs about me. She came to my parents' house one evening and asked to speak with all of us together. She told us that her counselor had helped her understand that her mind had been protecting her from unbearable pain by creating a story where her baby had survived. She said she was starting to have moments of clarity where she could acknowledge that her son had died with her husband, but that those moments were terrifying because they meant facing the full weight of her loss. What she asked for surprised everyone. She wanted to know more about my biological parents, about the sister-in-law she'd lost in the accident. She said that in focusing so intensely on her delusion about me, she'd never properly grieved for my biological mother, who had been one of her closest friends. My parents brought out photo albums and started sharing stories about my biological mother that I'd never heard. Sarah cried as she looked at pictures of the two of them together, pregnant and excited about their future babies. She told stories about my biological mother's sense of humor, her dreams for the future, her excitement about becoming a parent. As we talked, something beautiful and heartbreaking happened. Sarah began to see me not as her stolen son, but as the living legacy of her dear friend. She started asking about my interests, my personality traits, looking for connections to my biological parents rather than to herself and her lost baby. It wasn't a magical cure. Sarah still had difficult days where her old beliefs would surface. But gradually, she developed a new narrative that allowed her to love me without the pain of thinking I'd been stolen from her. I became, in her mind, the precious child of her beloved friend, someone she could care for and protect in honor of the woman she'd lost. This shift had a profound impact on our entire family dynamic. Sarah became one of my strongest supporters, someone who remembered my biological mother with love and could share stories about her that my adoptive parents didn't know. She helped me understand parts of my personality and interests that came from my biological family. The cruel irony was that Sarah had always been right about one thing. There was a special connection between us. But it wasn't because I was her son. It was because I was the son of someone she'd loved deeply, someone whose loss she'd never properly mourned because she'd been so focused on her own trauma. My relationship with my adoptive parents also deepened through this process. I realized how much they'd sacrificed over the years, dealing with Sarah's hostility while trying to protect me from the worst of it. They'd carried the burden of knowing the truth while watching both Sarah and me suffer from the effects of her delusion. The experience taught me that sometimes the cruelest behavior comes from the deepest pain. Sarah's years of criticism and coldness hadn't been about me at all. They'd been the manifestation of a grief so overwhelming that her mind had created an elaborate fiction to make it bearable. Now, when I look back on all those years of feeling inadequate and rejected, I see them differently. Sarah wasn't rejecting me. She was rejecting the reality that her own child was dead. Her inability to be kind to me wasn't about my worth as a person. It was about her inability to face the truth of her loss. The healing process is ongoing for all of us. Sarah still sees her counselor regularly and has started attending a support group for people who've lost children. She's become an important part of my life in a way I never expected, sharing memories of my biological mother and helping me understand my roots. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never overheard that phone call, if the truth had never come out. Would Sarah have continued to suffer in silence? Would I have spent my whole life wondering why I was so fundamentally unlikable to her? But I'm grateful it happened the way it did. The truth was painful, but it freed all of us from years of misunderstanding and hurt. Sarah got to honor her lost child by properly grieving him. I got to understand my worth wasn't determined by one person's inability to see past their own trauma. And our family learned that sometimes love looks like hostility when it's filtered through unprocessed grief. Sarah will always carry the scars of that terrible accident, and I'll always carry the complexity of being raised by people who weren't my biological parents. But we've found a way to transform those painful truths into something that connects us rather than divides us. The love was always there. It just took years of pain and confusion before we could recognize it for what it was.